Welcome. This is Managing Software Teams in Seattle. It's our second virtual meetup. So we've done this in person 4 times and then 2 virtually now. So, we're excited to do it, excited for everyone here to support it. Yeah, we like doing it. We'll keep doing it. Yeah, go ahead and get to the next slide.
All right.
Yeah, so we're going to spend a few minutes just kind of going through logistics, doing a speaker introduction, and then Kevin Goldsmith, nice enough to join us today as a guest speaker. Super excited to have him. I'm jazzed.
Me too.
And then after the talk, we're going to do like a small group networking, and then where we kind of break out and talk. You get to meet some people in your small group, and then also talk about the topic and the talk and come up with a question. Okay, so we'll go over that after the talk. And then we're all going to come back into a big group and have a Q&A session with Kevin up till about 7. So that's the plan. Okay, basic Zoom online meeting logistics. Pretty sure everyone here is doing online meetings all the time. So, mute unless you're talking, okay? I'll mute you if you don't. Try to get your videos up so we can see you. Okay, that's a big portion of this. You can switch to gallery mode. That way you can see more faces. I think that's great. And then feel free to utilize chat or ask questions as we go. I think we have like 22. You might get a few more to come in. Small enough, I think, where we can ask questions as we go.
So Nate, you didn't answer my question. Is this a picture of you?
No, but that was a picture we put up the first time we tried this. I figured that might be how it went, but we'll see.
Okay.
It might go like that.
All right, good.
So, real quick overview of what we're doing here. Okay, why we started this meetup. So I have a background in the military. I was a C-17 cargo pilot in the Air Force, and got out and got into IT project management and into the agile world. So a lot of Scrum Master work, technical project management, and realized the skills that I had as an officer translated really well to that space. Okay, which is also a lot of kind of this topic, autonomous teams, that we're going to talk about today. So much that I started a company called Form 100 Consulting. We hire former military officers, and we use those skill sets that we learned in the military to help teams become high performing, and we focus on software teams, and that skill set's important for teams to actually get that alignment and communication and apply the right processes for the right team. But as we were going with more clients, we realized, look, we're spending a fair amount of time with engineering managers, helping them do kind of the leadership stuff that we learned in the military. Okay, and whether you're managing a development team or leading a team in combat, all those skills are the same, and it's hard stuff. It's not easy. And in the military, we had a good support network for that. We had a lot of training, a lot of people we could reach out to and talk. We did tons of professional development, and so that's kind of what we were trying to recreate here, which is a place where engineering managers can come together to do professional development, network. And then also take some time to get out of the day-to-day grind and listen to leaders in the industry talk about things that you can maybe take back to your team. Okay, so I met up with Ron and managing software teams in Seattle. Okay. We got up with Ron, and Ron, essentially wrote the book on this. So he has a book called Managing the Unmanageable. And so together we came up with this idea, like, let's come together and let's try to get a community where we can, where people can lean on each other, to help do this type of work. It's hard. So that's the impetus of the meetup. And so I'm going to pass it over to Ron, talk a little bit about his background, and then we'll introduce Kevin.
So I live in both. So I have been living for the last 2.5 years in both San Francisco and in Seattle. I spent a few decades in San Francisco. I started split living between San Francisco and Seattle, and now since February 26th, I've been a permanent resident of Seattle. No going back and forth with the whole COVID thing. I've been a member of a group like this in the Bay Area, the Silicon Valley engineering leadership community, for almost 20 years. And I had grown my career from being a programmer to being a manager of developers, a director of engineering, a VP of engineering, occasionally a VP of product. And 10 years ago, I was in this group, the San Francisco version of this group, and we had a speaker who was talking about being an interim VP of engineering. And I thought, wow, I like parachuting into teams. Every company that's ever hired me has hired me to parachute into their team and fix something, help it hum, help transform chaos to clarity, help untangle the knots, and you could do that as a consultant. And so so it took me a couple of years, but 8 years ago I came out as a consultant, and I've had this opportunity. It's an incredible opportunity for the last 8 years to be an interim VP of engineering and parachute into teams because of a group like this. And so when Nate said, let's do one of these, I said, yes, let's do one of these. So as he said, I wrote Managing the Unmanageable. It came out 8 years ago. The second edition came out in December. And you can get a discount on it. Our publisher gives my co-author and me a discount code to pass out to our friends, colleagues, and relatives. 35% off. It's at informit.com/managing managing the second edition. So you can get that there. So we're going to do 2 polls for Kevin before he starts speaking. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen. So go to menti.com. Put in the code 34220, and I'll meet you there with a poll.
Hey, Ron, can you just give a definition of what you mean by autonomous team?
Kevin, you want to give a definition of what you mean by autonomous teams?
Sure. My definition of autonomous teams would be having the freedom to act independently.
So would a self-organizing team be a synonym for that, Kevin?
Not necessarily, but sure. Self-organizing to me would mean that the team forms and dissolves on its own, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the ability to make decisions and act on them without approval or direction.
Okay.
And hey, Ron, what was that code again?
34220.
Ron, could you actually put that in the chat?
Yep.
Sorry, is that a Menti link?
Yep. Menti.com.
There you go. It's in the chat for everyone.
Okay, and votes are coming in. So Kevin, are you looking at the results?
Yes, thank you.
Good. All right, about 2-to-1 no to yes. And so let's flip to the second question, and you should now see this one. Does everyone see the second question? In menti.com with the same code?
Yep.
Yes, we've got answers coming in. How are teams held accountable in your company?
What if there are multiple answers? This is a radio box, not a.
It is. We were assuming you would pick one for the predominant answer.
Pick your favorite.
fewer OKRs and KPIs than I was expecting. I don't know, Kevin, what you were expecting.
And I was actually just curious. I wanted to see, to just get a sense of what people are doing today.
Uh-huh. All right. So 30 more seconds. This is awesome. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and go back to sharing a slide so that I can, if I ever get my cursor back. And so for tonight's speaker, as Kevin Goldsmith, I'm going to point out what Nate did ahead of time, which is that when Kevin's done, we're going to break into small groups for 10 minutes. We're going to break into small groups of 4. Zoom will do that randomly for us. When we do that, introduce yourselves to each other and identify a top question for Kevin when we come back from the breakout groups. At which point you can type the question into the chat window. So the chat window in your breakout rooms is a different chat window than when we get back together. So if you put it in your chat window, do a copy and so that we paste it when we all get back together. All right, so introducing Kevin. So Kevin's been in tech for 28 years. So I ran into Kevin at an Agile meetup probably 2 years ago here in Seattle. And I, somewhere along the way, either that time or the next time I ran into him, I realized that he had been VP of engineering or CTO at Spotify. And I confirmed that he was at Spotify at the same time Henrik Nieberg was. And so my big question to him was, so your current company, are you using the Spotify says don't use the Spotify method. Don't anybody else do what we do, because it's applicable to us. So I said to Kevin, so are you using it? He said, no. So then I asked him to describe what they were doing and found him using something very similar to what Spotify was using, except he changed all the names of it, just as Henrik had changed all the names from team to squad and chapter to all those Spotify names. He had his own set of names at the new company. So I'm anxious to hear what's gone on since and what he can tell us about autonomous teams. So Kevin, I'll let you take over from there.
Okay, thank you. So I'll
stop sharing
see if I can share. Yeah. Yes, I think this should work. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. Can you still see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. I would hope so. So I'm going to apologize potentially in advance. The router in my office literally died 20 minutes ago. So I'm on I'm doing a cell phone connection right now. So problems may happen. If they do, I will disappear and then we'll endeavor to rejoin as quickly as I possibly can. So just warning in advance if that happens, you know where I went, and hopefully this connection is going to be high enough bandwidth that it should work okay. So, all right, we'll see how it goes. So yes, I'm Kevin Goldsmith. I'm talking to you today about autonomous teams. And, even before Spotify, I was a director at Adobe. I was playing with some of the ideas around how to make my organization. I ran a consumer photography product organization, and I was working at trying to figure out ways to improve speed of delivery and enable us to do more kind of lean development. And so we were playing with different ideas around autonomous team structures there in a very different kind of world. I was at Spotify for 3 years, right after they adopted tribes, squads, guilds, that whole thing. Worked very closely with Henrik on evolving that and growing that. And then since then, have been around, as you saw from the slide. So I'm going to start off with some principles. So these are the things that underlie everything else that I'm going to talk about. Hopefully you will agree with them. If you do not, just go with me because everything else builds from them, and then we can talk about them in the questions. So number one, this should not be, I would hope, very controversial. Data is better than opinion. Facts are better than opinion. So everyone has opinions, obviously, but if you're only dealing with opinions, how do you know who's correct? Is it the opinion of the most senior person? Data is how you decide. So understand your customer, your business, the environment you operate in, and make a decision based on facts. So for decision making, we always want to use data as much as we can. And there's a great quote I like from Arthur Conan Doyle from one of the Sherlock Holmes books. I never guess. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. And I've been in lots of organizations where this happened a lot. I'm sure several of you have as well. So the second, this is a possibly more controversial, or traditionally has been, which is that the speed of iteration is more important than the quality of the iteration. That doesn't mean that we abandon quality, but that getting our ideas to our customers into the market at a sufficient level of quality that we can trust the data that we get back from that is the most important thing. So I would rather put something into the world that I know has got some issues, but gets there sooner, rather than try and make it perfect and make it take twice as long. So that traditionally in some organizations especially is a little bit more controversial. But my own experience, having worked at Microsoft and done the multi-year waterfall releases where we spent, tons of time trying to get quality to a reasonable bar and shipped a feature no one cared about, I would much rather ship a feature with not that level of quality, but get information back from my customers on whether that's the right feature for them or not, and not waste the time. So these are interrelated, because the speed, moving quickly without data, means you're not actually learning anything. And then you're just doing stuff. You're not learning anything. There's no value in moving quickly without actually learning anything. On the other hand, if you focus on trying to get tons and tons of data, you slow yourself down. So you need to find the right balance of moving as fast as you can while learning all the way. And it's very much, if you're familiar with the lean build, measure, learn loop, this is kind of my variant of it, which is that data is driving everything, right? But data is informing your product vision, which guides the experiments you're placing to test your vision, which teaches you something more about your customer and your own product, which drives your product forward, which then provides more data, and then you go through that loop. So I want to be going through that loop in whatever company I'm in, whatever product I'm building, as fast as I can, as fast as is reasonable for the product and the market and the size of the customer base. So how do you get the speed? How do you get the speed of learning? Well, we're going to talk about it in a few different ways, but we're going to start off with the organization, because this is at its heart a talk about autonomous teams. So why I like autonomous teams, after, as you saw, I've been in the industry for a long time, and I've worked in very non-autonomous organizations for the first 20 years of my career, in big companies like IBM and Microsoft, where we were very much not autonomous teams. And then I started to find the constraints. Well, I saw the constraints of that, tried to figure out better ways to work, which is why I moved towards more and more autonomous teams, because they just go faster. Autonomous teams go much, much faster, just based on my own experience over many different companies, many different environments, different kinds of products. I've just seen this work. So this is anecdotal data in the terms of data, but I've got a lot to back it up. And because they go faster, they learn faster. And that's really what I'm trying to optimize on, is how fast can we learn? So just to define autonomy, this came up before the talk started. Having the freedom to act independently. That's the crucial thing for me. So the teams are able to act independently from one another, independently from senior leadership. They can make decisions and they can act on them. And that means that they're both fully empowered. They have the ability to make decisions, but also, and this is very important, resourced to fulfill their mission and their commitments, which means that if you have the ability to make decisions independently as a team, but you don't have the ability to actually act on those decisions, you can't really be autonomous, and you are now having constraints upon you that slow you down. So, if you looked at, you saw I have a Spotify background. At Spotify, that meant these cross-functional teams. And that is how I've tried to build teams, well, before and after, and still, is to make sure that every team has the capabilities in it to act on whatever their decisions they make. So where I've seen organizations struggle here is you'll have a centralized function like design or test or something like that that's in a completely separate organization, which means that the team is constantly having to request time, or can we borrow a DevOps person, or we need some time from a researcher in order to do this experiment we want to build, which means that they're now coordinating with other teams, they're now having to negotiate around resourcing, and it just slows them down. So ideally, if you can do it, and it is expensive to do it this way, you actually make sure each team is fully resourced in both people and software and whatever they need in order to act on the decisions that they put forward. So autonomous teams, if they have those elements, they can now generate their own experiments. They are learning independently, and that's important, and that's what drives the whole product forward. So I also want to be clear here, I'm not talking about autonomous people, I'm talking about autonomous teams. So this is very much a team approach, not an individual approach. And again, where not only do I see kind of organizations misunderstand autonomous teams, but also individuals who are in organizations trying to move to autonomous team structure, they think, well, this means I get to do whatever I want. That's actually not true at all. This is not about you being able to do whatever you want to do. It's about your team making decisions together. And so that's an important part of that, because the individuals on those teams have to be accountable to each other. They have a shared mission, they have shared goals, and they have to be able to rely on each other in order to achieve them. And that's an important part of this idea for me in the way that I've seen it be successful. So there's some requirements around building these teams. There's some things you just have to have in a culture. And if you don't have them in the culture, you're going to struggle. And if you want to move to more of an autonomous team model, you need to change your culture to support them before you try and do that. So first of all, communication. Communication is absolutely critical. And so communication from the team outward is absolutely important. So if we're going to enable teams to make decisions and act on them without a ton of gates they have to go through and approvals they need to get and constant reviews of the decisions they're making, they need to be very, very clear to the entire organization. This is what we're doing. This is why we've done it. Just documenting their decision processes and the stuff they're working on and the results they're getting. And it doesn't mean that they have to deliver it in a very specific way. It just means that they have to be extremely transparent so that other people can see and learn from them without them having to go through these different processes around it. Similarly, if you're an autonomous team, you need to be learning from the teams around you. So you need them to be communicating as well. So it requires a lot of communication. And it also requires context. And when I talk about context, I mean, this is another form of communication, but it's coming from outside your team, maybe from other parts of the organization, the sales team, marketing team, senior leadership, providing you the information you need to make those good decisions. Because if we're allowing you to make decisions independently, we want you to make good decisions, and you cannot make good decisions without the context of the business and knowing what's going on in other teams. Similarly, organizations that hoard information, whether deliberately or even thinking, well, they don't really need to know that. That's not important for them. I can't know what's important for you if you're making autonomous decisions. You need I need to be transparent, giving you all the information you need, whether I think you need it or not, to make good decisions. So that's another important piece of this. And finally, trust. Trust is the critical part. I'm going to trust the teams in my organization that they're making good decisions, which means that they're going to maybe make decisions I disagree with, and I'll find out about it later, and that's okay. I'm going to have to trust that even if they do something I don't agree with, that they're going to have good reasoning behind it if I've given them the context and I'm transparent, that they're closer to the problem than I am, and that they're going to make a good decision. So when organizations like these ideas and they want to use them, this is absolutely the hardest thing for organizations that traditionally haven't worked this way, for them to adopt. This is a massive problem. But when I talk to leaders in other companies, or I'm trying to convince a CEO to let me do this, it's always this idea of, we've spent a lot of effort to hire the people on the team. We've recruited them, we're training them, we're doing lots of things to get the best people into the company we can. And if we can't trust the people we're hiring, we're bad at hiring people. Either we're hiring bad people because we're not good at hiring people, or we're just bad because we should be able to trust them. And so that's where, if you can't trust the people you're hiring, that comes back to you. That's not on them. That's your problem. Right? So either you need to be better at hiring people, or you need to figure out what's going on with you that you can't let go. Sorry, I heard somebody. I just want to make sure you can all hear me and everything's good. Okay, great. So by giving teams context and trust and reducing their dependencies on other teams, they can make their decisions on their own, and they can execute on their decisions. They become autonomous. This is the crucial part. So often when I've talked to people over the years about team autonomy and building autonomous teams, I hear, well, that just sounds like anarchy, right? So what's going to happen is some team is going to decide that instead of making enterprise software, they're going to make video games, and they're just going to go off and do this because they can do whatever they want. And of course, that's not the case. That's not the case at all, right? But how do you actually make sure that happens? Well, because if you think it's just that, okay, we're giving teams the ability to make decisions, they're all going to go off in random directions, doing whatever they think is the right thing. That's not really setting up an autonomous organization for success. You don't want them all going in exactly the same direction, right? You don't want them perfectly aligned, because that's going to take a lot of coordination, a lot of processes, and all these kinds of things that are going to slow them down. And it's also going to reduce the creativity that they come to problems with. You want them going in generally the same direction. Some are going off a little to the right, some are going off a little to the left. That's fine, let them do that. But you want them going in generally the same direction. So how do we do that? Well, it's about, again, communication and context. It's about communicating a larger product vision to the teams and being very, very open about why we're going to do it this way, why we think this is an important thing, why this is a good destination. It's giving them that North Star. It's being very clear around company goals. These are the goals for the company. These are how we arrived at them. Here, if you're interested, here's all the data that brought us to these goals or brought us to this vision, so that teams can go and learn about this, and they know where the ultimate destination is, and then they can find their own route in the best way that makes sense for what they're doing to get there. So if the company and the leadership is providing the what, this is what we need to do, and this is why we need to do it, it's really up to the teams to figure out the how. This is how we think we're going to help make that happen. So for example, until very recently, I was the CTO at a company in London, Onfido. And Onfido is an ID verification company. And so if one of the company goals for 2021 was we want to grow 50% in the Romanian market. There's a team at Onfido that does document onboarding of legal documents, and they would say, okay, well, we know if we want to grow in Romania, we need to make sure we have all the documents for Romania. We can correctly extract all the information from them. We know what the fraud features are. We need to do all that. And nobody needs to tell them that. They know that because they know the problems that they solve in their mission. So if we come back to this idea, how do we know where we're going and how do all the teams align in some way? It's really setting this North Star and setting these goals and being very transparent about them. That tends to give a little bit of guardrails around the teams. It helps them orient. It helps them know where more or less they should be focused on. And that actually constrains the autonomy a little bit, but it doesn't really prevent them from making good decisions or having a lot of creativity in how they approach problems. So that's an important piece. The second part of that is, well, assuming they're all going in the right direction, how do we know they're actually making progress towards that end goal? And that's where we get to the idea of things like KPIs, key performance indicators, metrics that the teams have. So the metrics, especially if they're good metrics, where you could even have, and usually I have, a dashboard that's showing each team's metrics and how they're doing against them. That gives a lot of accountability. Either the team is moving things in the right direction or they're not. And if they're not, I can go and talk to the team and understand why. And if they are, well, hopefully they know it and they've already communicated, so I don't even have to bother the team. But that's and they also can tell whether they're doing the right thing. It's also things like best practice sharing. Best practice sharing, both from the sense that teams are, because they are autonomous, they're trying new ways of working and they're trying new practices, they're trying new tools. And when they find good tools, they can share that with the rest of the organization. And that becomes now a common way of doing things. But it's also things like the current set of best practices, when they are really universal in the organization, you actually build tooling to help enable them. And that allows, that gives another kind of sense of understanding the context that your choices are in. If you make the things that are the best practices easy to do, people just naturally do them. They're not constrained to do them. They're not forced to do them, which means if they have a way to do something better, they can try it. And if they succeed, it becomes a new best practice and then becomes part of the easy path. And then finally, leadership. So one thing I want to differentiate here is that when I talk about autonomous team models, I'm not talking about a managerless type of organization. I'm not talking about an organization with no leadership, a fully self-organized organization. So if you're familiar with Frederick Laloux, he wrote a book called Reinventing Organizations, and he classifies organizations into different levels based on their ability to self-organize and self-manage. His end state is something he calls teal. So teal is a very self-organized, self-managed organization. I actually, for the kinds of problems and the kinds of products I build, I think about more of the next level down, which is green, which has a little bit more involvement from leadership and management. The difference, though, is that when I think about leadership, you're not there necessarily to direct. You're there to support. You're there to watch and help when you see teams kind of going off necessarily in a bad direction. You can help nudge them back. So it's a little bit less of a directive command and control style of management. It's more of being good at setting vision, being good at communication, assembling the information the teams need to make good decisions, and then helping them when you see them kind of going off maybe into the weeds, because you have the benefit of the larger context and vision because of your position in the organization and because of your own experience. So I want to talk a little bit more about accountability, because accountability in an autonomous organization is really critical, and it has to be there for it to be successful. So when you talk about why it's not chaos or anarchy, it is because there is an accountability there. So again, when we come back to this team, this team that's fully resourced in order to act on the decisions they make, well, one, it's not a group of individuals, it's a team. And it's a team, usually, if you're building a reasonably sized product, it's a team in a group of other teams, each of which is kind of working on different parts of this problem. They have a hopefully distinct and unique mission that they're working on. And that team is part of a larger group, depending on the size of your company, and so on and so forth, right? So you have this sort of very natural hierarchy of teams, and these dots are teams, where you have teams working on kind of narrow problems that are part of a larger team that's working on a bigger problem that's part of a larger organization that's either building the product or solving a big part of the product. So that natural hierarchy of kind of concern at different levels of specificity, right, maps very naturally to this kind of thing. So when you have, each of this triangle represents the sphere of concern at each different level of the organization, and you might call it also like the amount of visibility across the organization and the business. So when you're trying to build accountability into the organization, the way I've done this successfully now at multiple companies is you have a sort of top down and then bottom up process. Goals come from the top down. So you first would say, so as a company, we need to grow revenue in this next fiscal year by 30% because we want to be able to IPO, which means that the things that we need to do need to have the right governance and the right things in place so that they don't prevent us from IPOing, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of detail there. That's a very high level goal that spreads across the entire company. At the next level down, be it a director in a software organization or the technology organization, you say, oh, okay, so in order for us to achieve that 30% growth in revenue goal, we see that we need to do the following things, and that's at the next level of specificity. And then it gets down to the teams, and the teams set their goals, saying, well, with the things that we do, we think we can help the larger goals this way. So you need that kind of context of the big goals, the next level goals, and so on, so top down. The other part of that, though, is how do you measure whether the team is actually making progress towards their goals? And that's where the KPIs come in. And the KPIs, the key performance indicators, go the other direction. They start at the team. The team says, well, we've agreed with our management that these are our goals for the team this quarter. And obviously, when you come down this triangle, ideally, the scope of those decisions is actually smaller. So the company might be for the year, the division maybe for the quarter or half year, and then the team is looking at a month or a quarter possibly, so that you have a lot more fluidity and a lot more flexibility as you go down. And so the team will say, well, these are the KPIs that we think are going to make sense for us that show good progress towards our goal. Do you, our leadership, at the next level up, do you agree that these are reasonable KPIs? And the leadership said, yes, we agree. So now it's a shared agreement, and you do that back up the chain. So that way, there's agreed upon goals for the team. There's agreed upon KPIs for the team to determine whether the decisions they're making are putting them in a good place. And so they can move forward, they can watch their KPIs, they can track against their goal, and they can do that pretty much independently. And that's an important part. They have essentially their own metrics that they can watch that lets them know we're doing the right thing here. So a point I want to make around KPIs, I always try and align them to real business metrics when you can. So having been a CTO, I've been responsible not only for product development and customer facing pieces, but also things like business intelligence and IT and internally facing things. So, or in security and things like that. So those teams, obviously they're not looking necessarily at customer metrics that they can directly influence. So they treat internal folks as their customers, and you build metrics there. But the teams that are building the product that touches customers in any way, shape, or form, I always try and have them own specific business metrics that they can say, if we're doing progress on this, not only do we know we're doing something good, but we actually know we're having customer impact. And that's an important part in accountability, because it really shows ownership for the team and their relationship to the customer. So I did talk about leadership. I just want to touch on that for a moment, and leadership in an autonomous organization. So the question is, like, how do you lead a team that you're trying to empower to make its own decision? Well, we didn't invent this in software. This has existed for a very, very long time in lots of different places, one being medicine. So if you're an ER doctor or a surgeon and you're treating a patient, you don't have to go to the hospital administration every time you want to say, well, we would like to intubate the patient. Is that okay? We're going to do a review next week at the review meeting to see if it's okay for us to intubate a patient. No, you make decisions based on your local information, the local context, and the mission that you have. And yes, you have some guidelines and you have some guardrails and you have some expectations upon you, but you're trusted to make decisions there. And even within that team, it's always going to be groups of different people, and one person may step forward at a time if it's important for them to take over. Usually you have sort of default people, but each person has their own role, and that role may ask them to move forward or step back depending on the situation. Another example is military. So military, you would think of as kind of the ultimate command and control type of organization. However, when a team is in the field, they actually have a lot of flexibility. They are not having to constantly request everything they want to do. They have a mission to achieve, and they have a lot of local flexibility to make decisions to achieve that mission. And they have just good best practices and guidelines around that. There's actually a good book I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. It's a story. It's from David Marquette. It's called Turn the Ship Around. It's in this specific context, this military context. He was a submarine commander and worked to change the crew of his submarine to actually be a very autonomous organization. And he talks about his experiences there and the challenges he faced. So it's a good book if you're interested in some of these things. I want to touch a little bit on software architecture for autonomous teams, because it's actually an important part. And it's important because of Conway's Law. I'm assuming a lot of you are familiar with Conway's Law. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but this is it if you haven't seen it before. Organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. So the idea is the way your team communicates dictates the architecture of your organization that your organization produces. And Mel Conway wrote this over 50 years ago, and we still talk about it because it just seems true. And it seemed true anecdotally, but Conway's Law is not a law like the second law of thermodynamics. Fred Brooks named it Conway's Law in his book, The Mythical Man Month. This was really just kind of like a blog post from a kind of disgruntled developer, to be honest. The original article, if you want to read it. However, it seems so true that folks like Harvard Business School have studied it and actually found a very, very strong correlation that the communication structures of an organization have a strong, strong influence on the architecture those organizations produce. Now that's important because what we're trying to build is autonomous teams. So if you have a software architecture that requires lots and lots of teams to work together, you're absolutely breaking team autonomy. You really can't have that. You have to do a lot of work to make that work. And folks have tried, and they can, but it's very painful. So if you're thinking about what a good architecture, software architecture is to enable autonomous teams, well, there's a somewhat obvious one, which is microservices, or if you don't like the word microservices, small service-oriented architecture-oriented services, right? That can be uniquely owned by the team. So the team can control the delivery schedule. The team don't need to work with other teams on architecture. They're black boxes. That gives those teams a lot of freedom in the decisions that they make. So that's an important part of this particular software pattern that really helps with team autonomy. And there's a reason why a lot of companies like Spotify, like Netflix, like Amazon have really focused on this architecture as a way of building fairly autonomous team structures. So the other part of this it comes back to accountability. which is if the team owns their services, they own their deliverables, they can control the speed of delivery, they have the ability to experiment without necessarily involving other teams. If they have operational responsibility, they have a significant ownership of quality as well, because they're the ones ultimately responsible. So that helps significantly. So I'm at time, so I'm just going to sum up very quickly. Not controversial, hopefully. Data, facts, more important than opinion. The speed of iteration is more important than the quality of iteration. This is something we can discuss if you disagree. Autonomous teams can iterate faster because they have fewer constraints on them, and they don't have to necessarily go through tons and tons of hoops in order to get things done. But for teams to be autonomous, they need context and direction and guardrails to help them narrow the decision spaces. And for autonomous teams to be accountable, they need to have mutually agreed upon KPIs to measure their performance, so they don't need to look externally to know how they're doing. They have complete control of some of the measures of their own success. And microservice architecture support autonomous teams by reducing dependencies between them. Thank you. So hopefully if you haven't tried, because I see most of you haven't tried this, it gives you some ideas to think about ways you can play with that, with these ideas, and maybe try and evolve your organization. And I'm really happy to take questions after this when we do our breakouts.
Okay, so we're going to move into breakout rooms. Thank you, God, thank you, Kevin. That was great. We're going to move into breakout rooms. Again, in your breakout rooms, do a go around, introduce yourselves to each other. There'll be roughly 4 or 5 participants per breakout room. So introduce yourselves to each other. Figure out what question you want to ask Kevin when we come back, or what issue you want to raise or concern you want to bring to the fore. Interesting. Okay, so here we go. Everybody ready?
All right, let's do it.
Okay, there's.
Hey,
Oh,
hey
there's
guys.
Spawn as well.
So I'm going to join you. You are only 3.
Yeah.
Everyone else got 4. So, hi.
Hey, Ron. Is it true that we only have a minute to go though? It says remaining 1 minute? Or...
No, that's not true.
Okay, good.
Sorry, my bad. My bad in setting and not setting up the options correctly. So
It may kick us out, Ron.
no, it will not, because
Okay.
it will prompt me to kick you out, and I won't do that. So I actually know how breakout rooms work. I just didn't cause this to go correctly. Sorry. So introduction. So you all got my introduction earlier. Mary, you want to go?
Sure. I'm a senior software engineering manager for the research software engineering team at Institute for Disease Modeling. And anything else on that? We work on several projects for research, but we also have workflow tools that we work on, but we also work on individual research projects and get pinged a lot for different requests from research too. So, there.
Cool. So Gopal, can you turn your video on? You have video?
I do have video, but I am not in a good shape to share the video. Is that okay, Ron?
All right.
Sorry about that. So Gopal Ranganathan, I saw this posted via Ron's posting, and I was interested in this topic. My background being in the program management, consulting role for 20 plus years. I am part of a real estate holding company right now, doing real estate tech in AI ML. That's what I do.
All right, Steve.
Yeah, so I'm Steve Thomas. I work at Getty Images, and I guess I've known Ron for almost a year now, seems like. So that's cool. And I manage the unmanageable, right? I manage software engineers. Been doing that for over 10 years. So I'm really interested in this topic as well. We've been, because of the way our organization is kind of spreading out and forming small teams, we can't be everywhere at once. So we're having to allow a lot more autonomy. So it's a good topic.
Cool. So burning questions, so we can open the chat. We can open our own chat. Burning questions to ask Kevin. Let's do a go around again. So Mary, Colin.
I don't know. I'm not quite clear on if, because the team set their own goals, but are those still tied to the organizations or the, depending on my company, we don't make products. We're working directly for research, but
Yeah, so I'm gonna answer that on behalf of Kevin.
okay.
I'm gonna answer that to the best of what I know on behalf of Kevin, and maybe we want to ask that further. What I heard from him was the executive leadership sets a very big goal, and then our team asks the question, so for our team, what's our goal given the overriding goal? How do we,
so I do that.
To the big goal?
Good.
All right, Gopal.
Yeah, I'm that this would work without too much chaos and too much, people going all over whatever way they want to. I understand the big goal, but breaking that down and actually prioritizing what you want is a big step in the whole process. And I feel like that is something that is missing in this picture. And who would do that? And if that is still done by product management and we have the delivery organization, then all we are trying to do here is saying, hey, instead of the OKRs or KPIs or whatever SMART goals being set by the manager, the team itself coming up with those goals. So I'm still struggling to figure out what the difference is with this versus, the organizations we currently have. That's what I'm thinking right now, Ron.
Okay, Steve.
My questions are always around changing a culture. I mean, what are the first steps? What do you do to get started? How do you get buy-off from the VPs and that kind of thing? That's always where I always start, because we've had lots of experiments in this area. But what do you do when you have a command and control culture? Not saying that Getty does all over, but how do you what are some of your first steps that you do to introduce this?
First steps. Yep. All right. What's that generate for? Do those three questions among the three of you generate any new questions from each other?
The culture question is definitely extremely important. And yeah, Steve, you're thinking in terms of how to implement this if we accept that this is the way to go. And I would say the culture probably starts with are we accepting this way of working together? And that's where my concern is, right? You know, is this the right thing to do? And if it is, why is it any different than what we have? I mean, it's not like, I mean, teams usually, in most organizations I've worked for, we generally ask the teams to figure out what they can do, sprint over sprint, release over release, right? With certain priorities given to them. So what is that we are actually changing when we set this? When we say autonomous teams, and that's where I think if we are saying there is a major cultural change, what is that and why? That probably will prompt an answer for your question, Steve, I'm thinking.
Yeah, you have to be able to explain the philosophy behind it all and really be committed to it yourself before you know you can implement it. Yeah, and then, but even as a manager, I'm not a VP. As a manager, how do I convince my VPs that this is the right way to go if they're not on board? Because they really do have to be on board for some of this, I would think.
I highly recommend reading the book Leading Cultural Change, or Leading Change by John P. Notter. I use this in every organization I go to drive change like this.
Can you show the author?
It was John P.
Oh, the Carter.
Notter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice,
Really
thank
good.
you, Mike.
I have a presentation on it too, if you want it.
Oh.
But the thing that I'm trying to figure out, the question I have from his presentation was on that data drives vision. And right now I'm trying to figure out how to get data in my org, because my team is pretty autonomous. The one I've just inherited, one of the feedback that they gave was like, how do I get feedback? Because, you know, I go and do something and sometimes the product is adapted super fast and other times it's not. So I'm looking at ways to try to get feedback to them faster, sooner, all the time.
So I want to bounce off your question, Mary. If we've got, you know, and so, you know, I typically bounce back down to Spotify. If we're all working at Spotify, how do I know what my team should? And there's a million things that we could work on that are aligned. I'm going to say there's a million things we could work on that any team could work on that are aligned with the big goal. How do we not have 5 teams all pick the same goal, for example?
Mm-hmm.
What makes each team uniquely picking the right thing, and how do we get the right? I've been in lots of teams where everything's not equal. There are definitely things that are, you know, if you've got one team working on the one team working on the web and one team working on mobile, and they can each pick out a thing, but that doesn't mean that mobile and the doing something on mobile and doing something on the web are equally valuable. One of them could be hugely more valuable. So I don't know how to do that in this model.
Yeah, that's true, because you would have to know, well, like, how do you get that data of knowing what is more important? I guess in Spotify's case, it's who's using what more and what do they want on those different platforms.
Yeah. Okay, so let's do a quick vote, and then I'll knock us out of the. You think it's been 10 minutes? I've also done a bad job of timing.
Yeah, I think so, Ron. Yeah.
Okay. So what's our most pressing question? If we of the questions that have been asked, I've got to vote. But what are your votes of the questions that have been asked? What's the most important question to ask first out of our breakout?
I like all of the questions.
Yeah, I do too. I do too. Any favorites? Mary, Gopal, Steve?
I'm curious about the culture question. I know it was mine. I'm just curious about what he would say. Like how do you change the? That's an easy one.
Yeah, I actually think I would vote for the culture question because it's I think the one thing that the rest of us have been asking about more about nuances, and it's the one thing I don't think he addressed at all. And so it would just open up a new channel of exploration by asking that one first. Mary and Paul, would you be good with that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right. So let me go to the breakout rooms and hit close all rooms, and that should give us a yeah, we got 30 seconds, not a minute. Also didn't set that correctly. So 30 seconds from now, and Gopal's already left. We'll be back in the main session. Any last?
They're all leaving, Ron.
All right.
Thanks for hosting, Ron. This is good.
Yeah, you're welcome, Steve.
There we go.
Whiplash.
Here we come back. Hey, Mickey.
I'm here. Co-author has shown up.
All right.
Yeah.
Hey, Mickey. Thank you for joining.
Hi, Ron.
All right, so doing from breakout rooms, doing questions. So breakout room one I had Mickey and Dan DiCamillo and Travis King and Daleen. Your question for Kevin?
I stumped him.
Sorry, I was looking for my mute button. Thanks, Kevin. Really enjoyed the talk. Thought it was really awesome. I guess my major question is, I work in an organization where the teams are not very autonomous. It's very top down. Wondering if you had any best practices or advice for getting buy-in from management to start going in that direction to work more autonomously.
So, when I was, I left, I was at Microsoft for 6 years. I left Microsoft, did startups, learned XP, started doing Agile, went back to Microsoft when the .com explosion happened. But now I was coming in, like having done Agile for a couple of years and not wanting to go back to the old waterfall way of working. And I thought, well, maybe I can convince like the VP or director to kind of let us try Agile. And yeah, that wasn't going to work, right? So what I did instead was found a good kind of project that everyone was sure was going to fail, right? And so at the time I was on the Windows CE Core OS team. And I didn't work on this piece, but I saw this piece was struggling, the build project, and how the OEMs who built products on Windows CE, they had to build their own version of the operating system, and they used different build tools than we did. And so no one thought, they all wanted to use our build tools. No one thought that was going to work. Everyone's like, well, we can try it, but it's never going to work. I said to the director, hey, why don't I try it? And we all think it's going to fail. It's probably going to fail. So that's fine if I screw it up. But if I'm going to do it for you, like switch off what I was doing, I want to do it in this kind of different way. Is that okay? He's like, yeah, it doesn't matter because it's not going to work anyway. I'm like, okay, I need a couple other people. He's like, all right, you can have these people. All right, great. And we built it with extreme programming. And we shipped it in 6 months, right? With 10,000 unit tests or something like that, which no one had ever written unit tests, ever, right? Except testers. Testers, SDETs had written the tests. Now the developers had written the tests. They wouldn't even give us an SDET. The QA team, the the test team said, we are not touching this, right? Well, we said, that's fine. Here's 10,000 tests proving that it works, right? And so what we did is found a little win that we could do that just validated, you know what, there's something here. And let's see if we can and grow it from there, right? Let's bring in some small projects. Let's show some of these ideas can work in very, very small ways. It's hard to get a senior leader, like, it's hard if you were in a company that I was CTO in and you're like, we need to do waterfall, right? We're doing agile, that's where it works. You know, I don't think it works as well as waterfall could be. Well, I'm going to be like, why would I do that? That doesn't make any sense. We're a great agile organization. We're never going to adopt waterfall. That's my bias, and that's because that's what I know. And you may have a different belief, but again, like, it's opinion. So that's where I like to bring facts in. Like, hey, look, we tried this project. This is how it worked out. We tried this other project this way. This is how it worked out. Find the small things that you actually can get approval on, because you're not going to change the whole organization at once. Because what you're trying to do is build culture change from bottom up instead of top down. So the best way you can do that is just by building a string of wins in very small ways that prove a larger point. And then as you do that, you'll start to find other teams go, hey, why, like, how'd that project work? Like, that worked much better than we thought it would. Let's find out, right? And then start sharing how you did it. Get some wins and then share how you won. And that will build interest in the organization, and eventually it becomes a fait accompli. Like, leadership has to support it. That'd be my pat answer to that question.
Okay, so that was a long pat answer, and
Sorry.
It also answered the number one question we had coming out of Group 5, and it was Steve Thomas's question. So I want to ask Steve, did that answer the question, or did you want to do a follow-up? And you're on mute.
Sorry, no, that was perfect. Thanks, Kevin.
All right, great. Then Group 2, which was Brian, Kevin Knepp, Matt Collins, and Tanya Stride. Your question?
Yeah, you pretty much answered it. You know, I wrote, how do we allow introduction of autonomous teams in a large organization? So, you know, pretty much answered. I would say that, again, from a perspective of government contracts, it is always difficult to do those changes, and even now that the government seems to try to or want to start embracing Agile, their acquisition processes are still stuck in 1990s documents. So,
yeah, this is the part where you end up having to, even if you can get sort of the ability to work the way you want to work within your little sphere of control, your interface to the rest of the organization ends up being a very traditional kind of thing. And so you have to build kind of shims in to sort of translate from what you're doing to make it look like you're doing what they expect you to do. There are governments, like I know a bunch of folks from the UK Digital Services, where they've actually started to adopt a lot more of these kind of practices in government, even though it is run by, you know, their parliament. Same with DCMS. They're here, obviously the US government digital services, because got Matt Cutts there. They've been trying some of this, and I've talked to some folks there, and they are actually able to do some things. So it's changing, but it's going to be a long time. I would say the other thing though is, so it's different if you're sort of a senior leader, because that's what we talked about in Breakout Room 4. If you're the senior leader trying to build this kind of new culture, it's a little bit different than if you're a member, a team manager, or team lead, and trying to build it kind of bottom up, where you don't necessarily have buy-in from senior leadership. If you're a senior leader here, because I've had to do that, the way you do that is by introducing, you don't try and change it as a top-down kind of thing, it'll never work, but you bring in little ideas. Hey, let's try this, or let's try that, and you start bringing in some of these agile or autonomous team ideas in a much more subtle way, but it's a long game. I made that change at Avo, but that was a 2-year change to make it happen. There was a lot of changing the culture very, very slowly, piece by piece, and then being ready for a much different kind of structure. But at that point, the organization was just ready to go. It was pretty instantaneous, but it took a long time to get there. But if you're in that leadership position, or you have the ear of somebody in that leadership position, then you can do it in a very different way.
Kevin, can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Sure.
I completely agree with you that these kinds of changes are very much long game. Did you know it was long game when you started, or did you? Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, sorry, I cut you off, but
no.
Yeah, I totally knew. Because I'd been, because I'd tried the bottom up thing at Microsoft, because I'd been at Microsoft, I tried the bottom up thing. I walked into an organization that was ready for change because what they were, I had the burning platform kind of benefit. They knew what they were doing wasn't working the way they wanted it to. They didn't know what they wanted to do, but I knew that if I just come in and said, hey, we're going to switch this journey team model and we're going to get rid of we're going to turn half the dev leads back into engineers because that's what they want to do anyway, and we're going to move to a much more agile thing, it would have gone over like a lead balloon. I had to start. I knew just talking to people and understanding their things that I had to bring it in piece by piece and just kind of set it up. So, yeah, it's going to depend on the organization, but you need to understand the organization, the will, and the kind of your baseline, and then you can decide how fast you can move. I will say that organization was desperate for change, so they actually moved faster than they should, and we kind of broke people where there was just so much change going on. Eventually we just had to stop and say, like, because people kept wanting to try new things, we had to stop after a little while because people were sort of losing their sense of what the heck are we doing here, and kind of settle for a little while. And then once we got comfortable, we started again.
So
thanks, that's really helpful.
Breakout room three was Claudio, Daedra, Jared, and Josh. Your question?
So ours is along the same lines as the first two, but it's a little bit more about as an organization is already starting to go through this and you have buy-in from one part of the organization. So in ours, we've got buy-in from autonomous team within engineering, but we don't necessarily have it with our design, our product, and even within like some of our Scrum Masters.
Wow.
So and every single team then has 4 or 5 different managers that are influencing that team. So what would be your advice? Like, how does it work within matrix teams, and how do you get buy-in from the other leadership?
Yeah, no, that's a tough challenge, right? So what I would look for would be finding the people in those organizations that are the most sympathetic, and try and get them to, again, run an experiment or try something for a little while. It's hard to do this, to be honest, it is hard to do this one team. It's hard to make one autonomous team. You really are trying to find the sort of minimal spanning set organization where you can have multiple teams, because one team has just got to interface with the rest of the organization, and if they're expecting you to deliver on something or whatever, attend scrums every day or get approval on stuff, is just not going to work. So you need to get either a director of product and a director of design to work with a director of engineering, where there's 3 or 4 teams that can work together, and they can kind of be that buffer, that interface to the rest of the organization, kind of be that umbrella over their teams. And it may just be a matter of time of just kind of working with them, pointing out what isn't working with the current structure and saying, well, maybe this might be a way that we can try this. It's unfortunate, like you absolutely need all the functions to buy in. And even if you got all of product development to do it, you actually also need finance and marketing and sales. You're going to have to get them comfortable with this idea as well. But again, you can't do it with one team. See if you can get a group of teams that would nominally have to work together and have strict dependencies on them, or you can relax that, but you have a sphere of control where that you can protect that effort and then try and grow from there, and just find the champions you can find in those other functions that are willing to at least try this with you, right? When I adopted Agile in 2000, I had no interest in, like, pair programming sounded like a horrible idea. Like, there's so many, coming from outside extreme programming, so many things sound horrible there. I just knew, like, I'd been at Microsoft for 6 years. I knew waterfall didn't work at all. And I'm just like, whatever, I'll try it, right? And never looked back, right? So you got to just get those folks, find those folks, do it in the best way you can. That'd be my best advice without more information.
If you don't mind if I have a quick follow-up, I mean, because we are an agile organization to the point of we do have our product team. And so I guess, like, ultimately in the organizations that have done this extremely well, has it been because they've removed some of the the amount of leadership, I guess? So instead of having leadership under engineering and leadership over design and over product, like instead you might have like one people manager.
No,
Okay.
not at all. So at Spotify, I had a product peer. I had a design peer. We were the trio. That worked fine, right? The difference was, and even I will say, the more senior product got at Spotify and the more senior people we hired from outside, the more skeptical the product organization as a whole became on the entire Spotify model. But what I'll say is, you know, at Adobe, I had a product peer and a design peer, same thing. So it absolutely can work in a multiple manager matrix organization. You don't need a single point there, but they have to work as a unit. They have to work as a team, and you really have to build it. When I go back again to my Microsoft experience, there was the different silos met so high in the organization, right? The engineering, program management, and test, they were just constantly at war with each other because they were constantly finger pointing who's screwed this up, right? So bringing that in at much lower levels. So every team I'm going to have, there's a product manager, an engineering lead, a design lead, if it's a UI type team, and they work as a unit, they work together, and it's expected that they succeed or fail as a unit.
Marty Kagan, who wrote Inspired, refers to those three as the three-legged stool that everyone relies on. So to go into breakout room 4, Kevin, you are in that room with Nate, Ram, and Sterling. A question you didn't discuss or that you want to bring to the fore to all of us?
We were also talking about, we also talked about experiment teams, like labs teams or new feature organizations, and how to make that work successfully in a larger, kind of more traditional organization. And my thing there, having done that at Microsoft and IBM and Adobe, is the thing I've just seen not go well if you have like a labs team, is that team becomes too divorced from the mainstream product development organization, so that when they get to the point of actually having something that's ready to go out in a bigger way, they just can't get any buy-in from the larger organization because they're seen as this sort of isolated team that doesn't understand the problems. And if it gets goes too long, they actually do tend to not understand the realities of shipping a product in the larger organization. The other part of that is, what are the metrics you would use for a team like that to measure success? And for me, that was number of experiments run per year, right? How many things have you shipped to customers? And you don't care, success or failure is not important. You shouldn't be looking at that in a labs organization. Failure, again, is an opportunity to learn. And so it's really how much learning can you do, and that comes back to how many ideas are you actually putting out into the world. And there was also the idea that somebody at Adobe had who was trying this in a very lean kind of a way, where they came up with a new non-Adobe brand that they ship things under, because that allowed them to do really horrible, bad products without the marketing team freaking out about ruining the Adobe brand. Because that became a serious issue when you were just shipping lots of tests, lots of ideas into the world.
So in breakout room 5, we had a long discussion about alignment and about the questions of alignment and really how we get aligned from that big goal that our executives come up with all the way down. And so if you go to the Spotify model, you've got a team that's working on the mobile, you've got a team that's working on the web, but that doesn't mean that the web team and the mobile team, that they're, what they would pick, what each of them would pick are necessarily equal in terms of how they meet that larger goal. And you know, maybe the mobile team should be picking another web goal because that's the most important thing. Two web goals are the most important thing. So how do you get the alignment?
To my point about resourcing the team, there was no mobile team at Spotify. There's no web team, there's no mobile team at Spotify. There are mobile developers. So I ran consumer engineering, which meant I was responsible for the iOS, Android, desktop, web apps, along with all the ingestion, storage, streaming of media content. So all the features. If you're using the Spotify product, it's all that. That's basically what my team. So every team, the teams were feature teams, which meant there was a team that owned search in the product, and they owned search on every platform. There was an iOS developer in that team, an Android developer, a web developer. Actually, we use web and desktop were the same developers, but that team, when they shipped a feature, they shipped it on all platforms, and they had complete ownership of that feature on all platforms.
So let me rephrase the question. Let's say that search isn't the most important, the search team would really need to embrace something that would normally be considered to be another team's aegis.
So if the search team, the search team is just trying to max, their metrics are time from putting your mouse into the search box to you playing music. That was the metric that they had, right? One of their primary metrics. If that meant that they needed to make a change to the playlist service that was owned by another team, there was a team that's responsible for playlists. They would make that change. They would make that change in the playlist service, but then there's a handoff process I created that was just kind of a simple, like, you know, if you're going to mess with somebody else's code, it's totally allowed, but here's how you do it nicely. But there was a little bit of a handoff process. Hey, we need to make this change. Is that okay? Yeah, we were about to make another change here that's going to break. Do you mind waiting a week? Okay, sure. Whatever. But then when you have it, and then the team takes the pull request, signs off, and now they own it. But that was expected, right? So Spotify worked extremely hard to never have things happen that required two teams to work on the same thing. Okay, so that's an important part. That meant that model, if you like that idea of this autonomous team model taken to the Spotify extreme, which is not what I would necessarily recommend. It works exceptionally well in a consumer product that is trying to, especially a subscription product, works perfect for Spotify. This is one of the reasons why you don't necessarily want to adopt it in every context. It's optimized to be just throwing a ton of innovation across a wide spectrum all the time. Tons of teams iterating on their missions and trying to maximize value or maximize their metrics across a large organization. So you have essentially like ooze happening. The whole thing's moving forward, and it's moving forward as fast as it can, but it's moving very broadly, right? That's different from somebody like Apple. Apple doesn't want to do like lots of iteration and step change and stuff. They want to do, here's the new, you know, AR glasses, right? That's a big change all at once, right? Delivered, boom, here you go. If we got it right, we're going to make another $1 trillion. If we got it wrong, we'll pretend it never happened, right? That's a very different model. So if you like this autonomous team model, think again about AWS, right? AWS is changing things 1,000 places all the time. That's that model. Netflix, Spotify, these models work really well with this autonomous team thing. If you need a whole bunch of coordination because we're launching a whole bunch of things on one day together, doesn't work great that way. One of the things I did at Spotify, so you don't remember this because it was a huge failure, is Spotify launched right before Apple Music launched. We launched a ton of features in a very coordinated way. And it was very much we want to push Apple back, right? And let everyone know we're the streaming music people. So, and we wanted to launch it right before Apple Music launched. So in this way, like I had to coordinate across several hundred developers and a ton of autonomous teams. We're all delivering a bunch of features that have to kind of make sense together because we need to tell a story. And we did that, in like the loosest possible way. Everyone understood the date, everyone understood like the bigger story we were trying to tell, but then each team did the things that made sense within that, right? So we didn't tell the search team, you need to do the following features and you need them to be delivered at this date. We said, this is what we're trying to do. There's a lot of innovation we want to bring here. There's some new stuff. We formed some new teams to deliver things. Some of those things were ready to ship on that day. Some of those things shipped a month later. But the idea was, this is what we're trying to do. And here's the context. Go and do the right things in your teams. You make the decisions you want to make in order to do that. So that is actually, while that effort, that big effort shipped on time, shipped exactly on the day it was. Nobody worked weekends. It was a successful engineering project. But because Spotify likes to do all this experimentation, and we couldn't do that because we didn't want to tip our hand, so we released a bunch of features on the same day, and we launched them to a small percentage of our user base, and collectively users hated them because we hadn't had the time to actually test and validate that these were good ideas because we didn't want people to know what we were doing. So what we learned from that was, yeah, let's please not do that. But it was more a lean thing, but we found a way to make it work with autonomy, but it was painful. It was not what the organization was optimized to do. I will say, out of that came video, podcasts, running, a bunch of features that people eventually found and loved separately. But after we had a few chances to iterate with them and actually get people to figure out what people actually wanted from them versus what we thought people wanted from them.
Kevin, can I ask a follow-up real quick?
Sure.
So I think that's a great example. Thank you for sharing that. Maybe even could you talk a little bit about coordinating, so maintaining a coherent user interface, for instance, right?
Yeah.
A user experience that's delightful to the user when all these autonomous teams are all working to optimize their own individual piece, right? So how do you coordinate so that everybody's not just optimizing for a search, playlist, whatever else, at the detriment of the overall experience, even if they're releasing leanly and not doing the big bang release? Like you can see over a period of time, this diverges where suddenly you have this sort of monstrous interface where everything is great individually, but as a collective whole, it's actually less than the whole. So,
yeah, I mean, if you look at Spotify circa 2013, you can see in the interface where the teams are. Like the organizational underwear is very proudly on display. Right. Because teams would use different UX affordances, teams would use different implementations of buttons and stuff like that because they weren't talking to each other. Right. One of the things we had to do after I joined to actually kind of harmonize and do this stuff, again, it was more about best practice sharing and not about strict enforcement of UX across the product. So what no one had done before that point, it was really Rochelle, who had been head of design at Netflix, is now again head of design at Netflix. She came in and kind of brought in the designers are all going to talk about what we are trying to achieve from design, so that when you go off and you're part of your autonomous team, you're thinking through these things that we've all kind of collectively agreed upon as a design organization, rather than set in a bunch of design reviews and cross-piece design elements. So it was really brought back to, it was still kept within those autonomous teams, but essentially we were setting a North Star around some common beliefs that as an organization we wanted to have. And then later, now there's like a design, now there's a team that actually owns some of the common controls. At that point, nobody did, but there's a team that's building the design library, essentially, that other teams are using, so that they can still go off and do their own implementations if they want to make a substantial change. But it's much easier to use the built-in ones. The easy path is easy. It doesn't prevent you from doing other things because that may actually be a better idea. But that's how Spotify evolved to get a much stronger kind of consistent UX. But you'll still see it in new features sometimes. You'll see some weird UX that's kind of un-Spotify-like, and that's a team just trying to trying to out some idea. And then they'll use their engagement data to decide whether that actually works or not, rather than try and do a big design review around it.
And then they would negotiate with that central sort of design team to say, hey, we're trying to do,
nope,
like,
they just ship.
Well, I'm sorry, once they proved it and like it works, and then there might be some reharmonization of that, like the design guidelines, or
possibly. Probably what's going to happen, to be honest, is one designer, whatever the designer on the team is going to, another designer is going to be like, are you serious with that thing? That thing looks like crap, man. And, it'd be more peer pressure than like, there is no, at least I can't speak to Spotify today because it's been a few years since I've been there, but there certainly was nothing. I ran consumer. There's no way I was going to do any of that kind of crap because I just didn't want to slow my teams down. So we didn't have anything like that process. That central team, it was a lot more about building a community of designers. This is, by the way, where guilds really come in the Spotify model, is building those communities of practice and just shared knowledge and shared understanding that cross the team boundaries and cross through those silos. And that's where it isn't like enforced process or anything like that. It's just kind of good ideas percolate around the organization and in a very informal way. And that worked fine up to, when I left, there were 800 developers on 4, 5, 6 offices across 9 time zones. But it still worked. It worked fine at that scale. I don't know if it's scale. I mean, ING is doing it with thousands, but
So we're way past 7. I want to acknowledge people's time. And I want to really thank Kevin for the presentation as well as the Q&A. I think this is really, really an interesting conversation that happened after the presentation. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. It's really fun talking about this stuff. I just enjoy it.
It's been a delight. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining in.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin. Appreciate it. Absolutely. So,
thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining. I think there'll be a link probably sent out with the recording so you can listen to it again.
Thanks everyone. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Thanks. Have a good day.
Thank you.
This was great. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yay.